way back in my day as a youth, this would be back in the late 70s, that was a very popular song by the gospel group The Imperials called Cast Your Bread Upon the Water. That ties in very well with our Sunday school lesson this week, as we'll see. As a reminder, we are in the unit entitled Refinance, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Money Management. This week we're in session 5 looking at Invest Money Wisely out of Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. And the point of the lesson is that when it comes to your money, plan and invest wisely. Our lesson this week, session 5, is the only lesson in this entire unit that is not out of the book of Proverbs. Now we know that the book of Proverbs was mainly written by Solomon. Now Ecclesiastes is also thought to be written by him as well. And why would we think that? You know, it might be good to give a little bit of background about the book of Ecclesiastes before you jump right into it. Well, first of all, we look to see what the internal evidence says. That is, what does the book itself say about the author? If we look in chapter 1, verse 1 of Ecclesiastes, we see that the writer is, he calls himself the son of David. Well, we know that Solomon was one of David's 19 sons. Also in that same verse, in 1:1, he says that he is king of Jerusalem. Now, we also know that Solomon was a king. Down in verse 16, he calls himself a man of great wisdom. If we look over in 1 Kings 4:29 through 31, we see that God gave Solomon great wisdom. Now, also if we compare Ecclesiastes 1:1 to Proverbs 1:1, we see a very similar introduction. And I'll just read this directly to you out of the ESV. Ecclesiastes 1:1 says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Let's look back at Proverbs chapter 1, verse 1. "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel." So we see a commonality here in just the introduction in the book. So we're going to assume that Solomon did write Ecclesiastes. Now there are only 6 verses in this week's lesson, and they're written very similar to Proverbs. And upon the first reading, at least this is what happened to me, I read through it and I thought, what does this really have to do with anything? Just on a first cursory reading. But as you read it, and you read it again, and you read a little more commentary, you see that the primary application, to me at least, has to do with work, and that can be applied to investing as well. So let's just look at a few things that might help us for this Sunday. So as we look at verse 1, depending on your translation, it may say something like, "Cast your bread upon the waters." That's why I played that song at the beginning. It also may say something like, "Ship your grain across the sea." So in your class, if you ask somebody to read, they may have a different translation, and so you might be prepared to address that. Now in verse 2, it talks about investing in 7 ventures, yes, and 8. This is a Hebrew literary device. It roughly means many. We see this used throughout the Old Testament. We look in Proverbs 6:16, and it says there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him. In the book of Amos, I believe there are 8 different times where the Amos says, "For 3 sins, yes, even for 4. So it's just a way of saying there's many things of whatever we're talking about. We're talking about sins or things that God hates. And here we're talking about investing out of Ecclesiastes. Now, to me, the general application out of the first couple of verses is to diversify your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. And also to me, that grain across the waters, to me, indicates a long-term investment. You're not going to see an immediate return, especially if you think back in those days. You send off your items to be sold. You may not see that investment for quite a while. Now we look down at verses 3 and 4, and we see those people who wait for the perfect conditions. And in the scripture, we're looking at farming. But we look at that as well as working, as well as investing. We see that those who wait for the perfect opportunity to invest, it'll never happen. To me, this is very similar to the parable of the talents, which is mentioned in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. You know, the man who was given the 1 talent or the 1 bag of gold, he went and hid that in the ground. There was no perfect conditions for him. He was afraid of what might happen. And so, to me, there's a good parallel there, the Old Testament to the New Testament parable. Now, like most things in the Christian life, there's a balance. We can't wait for the perfect circumstance to happen, to do stuff. But on the other hand, you've got to evaluate. You've got to use wisdom. We look in Luke chapter 14, verse 28, and it talks about if you're going to build a tower, you're going to stop and count the cost and make sure you have enough money to complete the project before you get started. So usually we err on either extreme. We can be impetuous and just jump into things, and to be religious about it, to be holy about it, we'll call that faith. And then on the other hand, we'll procrastinate, and we'll wait for that perfect condition to come along, and to be holy and to be religious about it, we'll call that wisdom or counting the cost. But there's a balance there that we need to find. We look on down in verses 5 and 6, and we see that investing, working, life in general is just filled with uncertainties. Now, especially for the original hearers, the items he mentioned here would be true. You don't know the path of the wind. You don't know the miracle of conception, of birth, how the bones grow in that baby that hasn't been born yet. So there are going to be uncertainties. So what we need to do is just work hard. Just work hard. We sow in the morning. Don't be lazy in the afternoon is basically what the writer here is telling us. We don't know for certain what venture is going to succeed. If it's going to fail, we just need to work hard at it. Use some wisdom, but work hard at it. All the time realizing that God is in control, and we really can't understand His plan. And if what we do fails, and it looks like it fails miserably, we may not understand the big picture of it all. Now, there's a saying that's attributed to St. Augustine that says, "Pray as though everything depends on God, and work as though everything depends on you." And I really think this helps explain our lesson this week. We need to wait and pray. We need to rely on the Spirit and have faith. But we also need to do. We need to work. We need to invest. It's a both and. James, the New Testament writer James tells us this, that tells us that faith without works is dead. There's a balance. We have faith. We have to do something at the same time. Faith without works is dead. Now, to me, our lesson has many applications. Of course, we've been looking at work and investment. But also, we can apply this to evangelism as well. We need to look at evangelism as a long-term investment. We may not see those immediate results. We know that's what? Some plant, some water, some reap. So when we share our faith, when we share the gospel, we may not see an immediate reaction. We may not see an immediate acceptance of that. But we have to be diligent in working and doing that. There again, there's never a perfect time. The circumstances just aren't always exactly like we want them in order to share the gospel. But we have to do it anyway. And there again, like our investment, evangelism is a joint effort between us and God. We always need to be ready. We always need to be ready to share. But we also need to rely on the Spirit's guidance. We also need to be diligent in what we do and keep after it, because we don't know who will and who won't accept the gospel message. I'd like to leave you with a teaching tip this week, and I'm going to just admit right up front that I'm stealing this from Andy Stanley and North Point Church in Atlanta, and that is that people learn better in circles than in rows. In fact, that's a saying that they have at North Point that's just part of their culture of who they are. And so I would encourage you in your classroom, if your classroom lends itself to it, to put your students in a circle instead of rows. And I know rows are easier; they're easier to hide in. But people, I think, learn better in the circle where they can see each other. When they're talking, they're not just talking to the teacher, to the leader. They're actually talking to each other and learning from each other in the process. So anyway, that's the way I like to do Sunday school, and hopefully you do too. Well, that's all I have for this week. Next week, we're back in Proverbs, finishing up the last lesson in this series. Don't forget to pray for your class. I hope to see you Sunday.